It's a great pleasure to be here with Christopher and Gary, who you will know are both at the time photographers with Seven, now with the Seven Foundation, and also Peter Maass, who is a journalist who at the time was writing for New York Times, New Yorker, other outlets, and is now a senior editor at The Intercept. And we're going to be talking about kind of two phases in the reporting of the invasion and the war in Iraq. That is the early invasion period and then the fall of Baghdad in April 2003. To begin with, Christopher, you're going to start and show us some of your work, talk us through that for about 15 minutes, and then tell us how you came to be covering Iraq and some of the constraints in that process.
Well, I'll do it kind of on the flip. I'll just start real quick on how everybody kind of knows at the time I was working for Time magazine, a major US publication. I was a contract photographer with them. I covered the first Gulf War and was in part of the newly initiated pool system. And understanding all its faults and hazards of hazards involved with that. Fast forward to 2003, I'd left conflict photography. I was covering the White House, and after September 11th and being so close in proximity to Bush and doing a lot of behind the scenes work and hearing talk, and even went to Afghanistan with the Special Forces in 2002 because of CENTCOM and connection with Tommy Franks and all that, all those kind of inner people you kind of meet covering the White House. And there was all this talk about going to Iraq, and I could not believe that they were going to do it. Hearing that in 2002 in Afghanistan from Special Forces people talking about it. So when it came about, I'd left conflict photography, but I knew this, if they're going to invade Iraq, this is going to be major. And I didn't, I just knew that this is going to be really serious. So I had talked at time that they asked me, would I be interested? And I could not let my wife know at the time. My wife was newly pregnant and I didn't want to let her know. So I told them I was, but long story short, I ended up missing the embed because the military called Time magazine at one point and they needed to know the actual name of who was going to be on the list. And I had just returned from Washington. My wife picked me up at the airport and I had Marianne Golden from Time on the phone. She wanted to know, was I going to embed? I need to know, I need your name right now. And I hadn't told my wife. I'd already been over to Kuwait accessing vehicles. I got vehicles for the other photographers, for the writers, generators, tires. I'd already been over working in Kuwait. So I told her I didn't want to say no and miss that opportunity, because covering this war, if I was going to cover it, covering it unilateral, meaning going in on your own. I had been in the Kuwaiti and Saudi desert and in Iraq before, and I knew traveling alone, it's not an easy task. It's very dangerous. So I wanted somehow to have some connection to the military. So I said, yes, I do the embed story. Long story short, I missed the embed. My daughter wasn't born in time. I was not able to deploy. And I ended up going over basically 2-3 days before the invasion started. And I'm going to kind of show you a run through. I'm not sure because of the time limitations on everything. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's go. So yeah, and I ended up going out. This to me was my most symbolic picture from the war. And so I couldn't believe it. From Florida, and 3-4 days later, I'm at Tallil Air Force Base. The third ID, this was their first objective. At the end of the thing, I'll continue the story how I ended up here. how I got with this unit, because I'm not an embed. And I'm photographing. I'm gonna, if I pause this for a second, this is interesting. This last image. Now, through composition and structure, it's like the humiliation of this, just to go in and show the fist and all this. It's whatever. It's just this is that next morning, and then they start the move north. This is the unit I ended up with. That was with Bradley vehicles and tanks, and I worked out of a 113 with the first sergeant. And this is during the sandstorms close to Najaf area, and people understand, it went on for several days, the sandstorm. This is like in the early morning, but it's like nighttime. You can see the fear on that child's. And this is consecutive. You can see how I went in and worked. But the thing is, for me, because I am there, I'm within, I feel like one of them. I feel like one of these occupiers. And this bit, this Marlboro image on the right. So the convoys were getting ambushed, and the units I were with were sent back to try to, they were hunting for RPG teams that were ambushing the convoys. And this is the vehicle, and the first sergeant's on the left. That's who I was with for those 21 days. And this is an interesting story. I'm going to pause this here. Stop. People, actually, I can reshare because this is important. Stop share. This image here, people have to understand I'm with these people, and they are feeding me. They're providing me shelter. So there's a lot of self-censorship that has to come into what you're doing. And there was an incident, and I'll give this example. When we reached Baghdad, I saw the soldiers looting. Actually, it wasn't, it was it was just before Karbala. There was an area we went through, and they started breaking into shops to steal coke and steal cigarettes and stuff. And I remember the first sergeant and stuff was watching me, and I didn't take a picture of that. And I've censored myself. And the reason I don't take a picture of that is because up the road, they're going to kill somebody. And if I take a picture of them stealing and doing what any soldier was do, looking for some coke and some cigarettes and breaking into a shop, that I will not have access up the road. So when they kill somebody, when they kill a civilian, that's when you want to play your cards. This was an incident where we set up a block near Karbala, the Karbala Gap. We were just outside of Karbala, and we were put on a position to a road coming straight from Karbala. We set up the barbed wire. We weren't there 5 minutes, and a vehicle starts coming up the road, a farmer's truck, and I hear somebody yell on the radio coming from a Bradley vehicle, "Don't let that vehicle come up the road." And it's like 500 meters out, and it's closing. It's a big like dump truck, farm vehicle. So at around 200 meters, they start opening up on the vehicle. At 100 meters, the truck doesn't know what's going on, and you see the little grenades from the bottoms of the guns exploding around it. And eventually they start spraying the cockpit of this truck, and it goes off the road. We all kind of run up, the squad, we run up to the car, and sure enough, open up the door, and it's just a dead farmer. And I'm instructed by the first sergeant, when I was running the truck, he grabbed me, he says, "Don't you take a picture of that body. I know what that's going to look like." And I said, "Yeah, you've just killed somebody. You've just killed an innocent farmer." And he says, "Yeah, but he wasn't stopping." And he said he wasn't stopping because he didn't know this at 100 meters. A man standing on the road that's just come off of Mars, and he's in his farm area. He didn't even know, who is this? And they told me not to take a picture, but they yelled at somebody to move that, get that vehicle out of the road. And the private went to go around the vehicle, and he didn't know how to drive a stick shift. And I went around the road, and I saw the soldiers watching me, "Don't take a picture." And he didn't know how to drive it. So I knew how to drive it. So I put myself in the vehicle. I picked it. I moved the driver. The picture you see through the windshield is I've messed the scene. I'm now, even though I'm a journalist, and I got in the car and I drove it like 50 meters down the embankment and got out and swung out and made a picture. And they asked me to see my pictures when I got up, but I swipped my card. I already knew I was going to have to flip the card. And so that's that. That's where you play your hand, because they don't want that image seen. So I'll share. I paused that there. Sorry. I've got 5 minutes left, so let me share screen.
Oh.
So
So Chris, were there many
important
Chris, were there many times that you felt that you self-censored yourself?
no, I'm shaking. I can't get my my hand back. It makes me nervous. This picture. So you see him up here, he's watching to see if I'm taking a picture. I had to stand on the bumper. Now I have moved this young man who's been shot in the face. He had a bullet in the face and several in the body. He's dead. He was gurgling blood out. So yeah, what the heck? No, when I say no, there aren't. But yeah, you're living with these people. So yeah, you're self-censoring yourself the whole time you're with them, because you don't want to let them know how you really feel about what they're doing.
So you were not formally embedded, but you were practically embedded.
Yeah, I'm not formally, but I mean, and I actually, they were upset that I was there, the DOD, when they found out I was with this unit, because the Tulil Air Base, all of a sudden my pictures are in Time magazine. My pictures were the first pictures that go out outside of the wires of that first day. And this is interesting. You see this, when we poured into Baghdad, I'm at the tip of the spear. The tanks are just blowing everything off the road. If you're on the road, I don't care, civilian car. We didn't come through on the side the Marines came through. We came through the Sunni area. We went up. We're going to the north. We're trying to get up to the road to Tikrit, the northwest of Baghdad, to cut off things. And basically the tanks and the Bradleys, they just destroy anything on the road. And we're just passing. At one point we hit here. I jumped off I jumped off my vehicle. There's no soldiers here. I'm down on the ground by myself photographing. And at one point I'm standing over a dead body, photographing him. And I'll pause this stuff here. I got a minute. I'll get this over and I'll finish this. Stop share. Because this is interesting. I get off the vehicle. I realize I don't know where our final destination. There's bodies everywhere. We've just rampaged. I'm seeing civilians. I'm seeing army people, taxis, buses, fuel vehicles. They ran into this like army camp in Northwest, and they just blew them. They just blew through it. And there were body parts. I jumped off the vehicle because it's a long convoy. I'm going to get all right. They're not stopping. And they were mad. They kept going. The vehicle I'm in can't wait for me. They can't come back for me. And I'm standing, and I don't have a weapon. I'm in jeans. I've already changed out of my chemical suit. I don't want to look military, but I'm military. I'm an American. I got a helmet on. I'm standing over an Iraqi body, literally straddling, photographing him. And it turns out he's alive. He grabs my leg and opens his eyes. He's a colonel. And eventually people came back, and there's you see a guy laying in a river. I hear somebody off the side of an embankment screaming. And I look over, and there's this angry Iraqi soldier who's been blown out of his vehicle. He's fell 30 feet into a ditch on some nails. And you know what he's screaming? Fuck George Bush. He's speaking English. He's screaming. And I swear to God, it's like, what the heck? That's that guy in the ground. Hold on. Yeah, so I went to stop recording, share screen, quick time. So yeah, this is that whole scene. This is me jumping out of the vehicle. Hold on.
Chris, we can't see that, so you need to share the screen.
I did share. Sorry, there it is. Share.
There you go. Yeah.
Sorry, I was on. And then eventually, this guy. He's like down in the thing. This is the colonel I was standing over, and he grabbed my legs, and then I went and got some guys out of a Humvee. And these guys were tasked to start getting the bodies out of the road, because this is where we were going to camp for the night. And this is mind-boggling. The earth was on fire where we were. It was burning. There was so much chemicals in the air. And the thing is, for me, well, the statue's coming down. I'm guarding a water treatment plant, and this is in the palace. Eventually, I was able to make myself over to one of the palaces. This is like on the 10th, 11th or something, 11th. And then after that, man, I got out of there. I got on a plane and got back. This is the guy, the famous Thunder Runs Perkins. That's near Karbala. I rode on the outside on the top. I never rode. And this picture I'm not proud of, but this is when I made it across. I made the embed 3 days before. I'm in Tampa with a newborn baby. And I'm not proud of that picture because I have my hands in the air and I'm happy. And I shouldn't be happy. I should be embarrassed that I'm like with Nazis invading a country. And that's how I feel sometimes. You know, so yeah, that's my 21 days with a newborn.
Thanks, Chris. Did you were taking those photographs for Time?
Yes.
Did you have any say in which ones Time published, or did you know
But
which ones
I
Time
have
published?
what I send them. Everything you see here, I sent them.
Yeah.
If you get access to the 7 archive, pretty much my whole take. It was 2003. We're shooting digital. I had a B-gun. I wrote on the top. I had a box with a strap down outside the vehicle with my computer, Pelican case. I rode outside. I refused to ride inside. I learned early on in the first invasion when I saw what the Saudis did to what the Iraqis did in Kafja to the coalition forces. And I got to photograph the freshly burning vehicles, armored vehicles. It's like, I don't want to be on the inside of an armored vehicle. I like to ride on the roof. And yeah. So yeah, back to the picture thing. I send them pretty much everything. I'm pretty good at it. Pretty good at it. And then it's up to them to do their moralist, you know, mission accomplished, America's happy, liberated, the whole thing, you know. And yeah, we are part of that media, Western media, in essence, pushing an agenda that's out of our control. But I'm a historian. I own my archive.
Yeah. But at the same time, you're documenting everything, and
No, I'm using everybody as a grant. I'm using the military. I'm using Time Magazine. It's a grant, so I'm able to produce and document. You know, I'm an anthropologist, basically. I try to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Gary, tell us about how you came to be covering Iraq, and you're going to show us some of the images from your entry into Iraq and the passage to Baghdad, and of which Peter was also a part. So
yeah. So thank you, David. Thanks, Christopher, for sharing that. So Peter and I were also unembedded, and we had been based in Kuwait for quite a while. And on the day of the invasion, we tried to make it across the border, which proved to be pretty difficult, actually, getting through military police checkpoints, etc. And like Christopher, I had considered being embedded because I thought it might give me better access to the war, which I wanted to photograph from the US perspective, from the invaders' perspective. But ultimately, I decided that being, independent would be the way to go. And although, there were different risks involved and different compromises that you had to make, I thought that would be the way to go. So Peter in his car, you can see Peter's car here in my wing mirror, and I and a group of other journalists, small group of journalists, sort of all corralled, actually met on the border, drove across the border on the morning of the invasion, or in the afternoon, I think it was, by the time we made it across. And pretty quickly figured out that operating truly independently would be very difficult because the US military and their allies were moving so quickly. The areas behind them were not secured. And we had some pretty uncomfortable incidents on day one, and decided that we needed to head up the road. Correct me if I make any mistakes here, Peter. My memory isn't what it was, but we decided we would head up the road and try and connect with a US military unit and sort of follow them, if you like, in pretty close proximity. And to cut a very long story short, so this is our journey up the road. We're just driving through columns of, these are mostly Marines. To cut a long story short, you know, we were several colleagues, actually, one from Reuters, one from CBS, tried to have us returned and thrown out the country because they resented our presence. They were embedded. They didn't want anybody who was unembedded around. That was a pretty extraordinary experience. One of them, Peter and I knew from the war in Bosnia, indeed. So we confronted some pretty uncomfortable things. But eventually we came across this unit, the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, who are the unit who pulled down the statue in Firdos Square several weeks later. And the colonel of this unit didn't really take a lot of persuading to allow us to travel with him. He was told by his superior officer to turn us around, but he said, the Marine Corps Code of Honor won't allow me to put civilians in harm's way. His commanding officer said, well, you know, you have to take responsibility. And he agreed to allow us to travel with his unit. But until we got really to the outskirts, the suburbs of Baghdad, we really couldn't do very much. My recollection is we spent most of our time sitting in our vehicles, driving at a very slow pace, crawling to Baghdad, and periodically the unit would go off, get engaged in battles with Iraqis, which we would hear about, but we weren't allowed to document. But one day when we arrived just on the outskirts of Baghdad, the colonel said, you know, you're free to work. And by that point, I think we had built a pretty decent relationship with him, with his officers, and with the Marines. I'd certainly given access to the Marines to my satellite phone, which was Newsweek's satellite phone. I was working for Newsweek at the time. And I remember on the first day of the battle, I'm about to show you, you know, the Marines were joking with each other that they had to be careful not to kill me if I walked into a room behind them because I was the guy with the phone. So I think things like that sort of helped us integrate into this unit. But I felt, and I think Peter may have felt the same, that we were pretty candid with the Marines about our view of their conduct of the war. And we had some pretty serious dialogue with the colonel, with other officers, about the excessive use of violence. We felt that they had committed crimes, killing civilians on the way into Baghdad. We were pretty candid about that. And I remember one conversation with Colonel McCoy where he said, we'll just have to agree to differ, Gary. But he didn't throw us out the unit. He let us stay in there. And in fact, we've remained in contact in the years since. So yeah, we had quite a different relationship, I think, or I certainly felt that I did. So this is the beginning of this battle, Diyala Bridge, sort of moving up a road towards the bridge, searching house to house. You know, a lot of destruction, as you would imagine. But all pretty straightforward up until this point. This is Colonel McCoy here on the left. We're at a canal here that there's a bridge that we need to take to cross over a canal. But at this point, things went slightly wrong. You can see here shells landing in the canal. And our position was shelled. At the time, I was told it was friendly fire. Later on, I was told that it was Iraqi fire. Nevertheless, what happened is shells landed on our position. One shell entered the turret of this armored vehicle and exploded inside, killed 2 Marines, wounded others. And at this point, you know, the Marines who had been sort of contained and stopped at this canal were pissed off. They were angry. They wanted to move. And, you know, the colonel gave the order to take this bridge, which they did. And on the other side of the bridge, as a dead Iraqi soldier, you know, they confronted civilians who were fleeing Christopher's military army, who had made it to the outskirts of Baghdad on the other side of the Tigris River. There was a lot of bombing still in Baghdad. So civilians, the only route open to civilians to flee the city was to head south directly into the Marines, but they didn't know the Marines were there. They drove into the Marines, very similar to Chris's description, with the death of the farmer driving the truck. The Marines just opened up and killed a large number of civilians in cars and minibuses. So this was, I think, Peter, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of days or 3 days before we made it into Iraq. Here, Peter and I, 10 years after the war, Peter's initiative contacted the tank commander, Lieutenant Tim McLaughlin, who was in the unit we were with. I didn't ever meet Tim during the war. He was in his tank and I was in my rental car. But we've become very close since. And Peter and Tim and I put a project together, re-examining our recollection of the war and re-examining the events there and reinterpreting them using material in addition to the journalism that we produced at the time. There you go.
Gary, did you feel that you had very candid conversations with the commander of the unit you were with? Did the photographers and journalists who were officially embedded have the same sort of candid conversations? What was their relationship to the unit in that sense?
I think they did. In fact, they were colleagues of Christopher's, worked for Time magazine. They were wonderful. They were the only embedded journalists actually who embraced us, and I think actively encouraged the colonel to allow us into his unit, which was really incredibly generous of them. But I believe they had the same experience. Bob Nicholsberg, yeah, and Simon, I forget Simon's last name, but Simon and Bob, yeah. But I think they had the same relationship. Simon Robinson, thank you, Peter.
Yeah. Peter, tell us a little bit about the experience of traveling in that convoy with Gary and the others from your perspective, being, as a journalist looking to write articles. Is it a different experience to that of a photographer looking to take pictures? Are you having conversations with members in the unit all the time?
Yes and no. I mean, I had hoped it would be a different experience because I was not intending in covering this invasion to have the experience of a photojournalist. These photojournalists, Chris and Gary are perfect examples of it. There's so many others, have to be at the very front line where everything's happening, because they've got to get the pictures of it as it's happening. As a writer, it's nice to be where things are happening. You try to be where things are happening, but it's not 100% necessary. And it is extremely dangerous and takes a lot of skills that are developed over time in order to survive. Frankly, although one can call me a war correspondent, or as my wife calls me, a recovering war correspondent, and I don't do that stuff anymore. Haven't for a while. But at the time, yes, okay, you could call me a war correspondent, but my skill level, which was pretty good, was nothing close to what these folks had. And I didn't want to do exactly what they were going to have to do. So when the prospect of the invasion is coming up, I was working as a contract writer at the time for the New York Times Magazine. And my editor said, and I'd covered the war in Bosnia, written a book about it, had covered some other conflicts. And so I said, okay, great. We want you to cover the invasion of Iraq. And I was like, okay, well, get me one of those embed slots. Because I knew what being a unilateral, traveling on your own in your own vehicle journalist in a war zone meant, what it would be like and what it would probably be like in Iraq. And it would be, to not kind of mince any words here, fucking dangerous. And I was more than 40 years old at the time. I guess I was closing in on 43. And I didn't want to have to deal with all that. And also the logistics involved in getting yourself ready and knowing where to go, trying to figure out where to go, all that. I was just like, just get me an embed, one of those sweet embed slots. It was a chicken shit way to cover that war, but that was kind of what I wanted to do. And the way the embed program worked, and this was the Pentagon's doing, you know, they had, I don't know how many embeds overall, Chris or Gary, maybe you know, I think maybe 200 or 300, let's say, I don't know the exact number. And then they kind of on their own, the Pentagon decided how many embeds each publication would get. And I think the New York Times got somewhere around 10 or 12, maybe, I don't know the precise number. But the New York Times Magazine is kind of like, you know, the orphan of the New York Times organization. And so the New York Times, the newspaper, basically took all the embed slots, and the magazine got 0. So my editors came back to me and said, okay, well, sorry, those sweet embed slots are all gone, taken by the newspaper staff. So you're going to be doing this unilaterally. So I went to Kuwait and, you know, went to the Avis or Hertz rental place, got a SUV. The photographer who I was assigned to work with, Laurent van der Stock, Belgian photographer, lives in Paris, one of the premier war photographers, still very active, amazing individual. You know, he got his SUV. And, you know, getting across, Gary didn't really go into it. You didn't just drive across. I mean, you did drive across literally in your vehicle, but you had to sneak across because the US military did not want any unilateral journalists in the war zone. And so I don't know exactly what Gary's experience was, but with Laurent and myself, we headed out in the pre-dawn darkness of March 19th, whatever it was, hearing the helicopters, Black Hawks going overhead, heading into Iraq. We were right on the border, kind of squatting in a farmhouse. So it's like, okay, now's the time to move, 3 o'clock or something like that. We drove out. And, you know, we had maps of the border areas with some of the roads. And I followed Laurent. He's much more experienced at this than myself. And, you know, basically, you know, we kind of were looking for combat. And you could see artillery strikes landing in the distance, kind of, this is Basra, 40 kilometers away, kind of headed towards that. And we hit the border and all of a sudden heard out of the side of our windows, you know, stop your fucking vehicle, turn around right now. And it was American soldiers in camouflage paint. And they said, like, we were just about to shoot you guys. And we turned back. And then we kind of spent a couple of very frustrating hours kind of going up and down border area on the Kuwait side, looking for some way to get across because all the official crossings we couldn't get across. And in the end, we found this kind of empty no man's land, which was probably mined. Laurent kind of walked across it first to see if there were open signs of that. And then he came back to me and said, okay, I don't think it's mined. I'll go first. You follow my tracks 50 yards behind. Don't get out of my tracks. So he went first slowly. And we got across, and there was actually a little Kuwaiti checkpoint at the end of this vacant area. And we just put on our military jackets because we had those. We'd gotten those in Kuwait. And just bluffed, pretended, you know, shouted at these Kuwaitis, like, what the fuck are you doing here? Let us through. Pretended that we were American military. And they let us through. And then we joined up in Safwan with kind of the main US Marines, as it were, and some Brits element. And since we had gotten across the border, it was okay, kind of. You know, there was no longer as much control because all the military that had gotten across the border, they were invading Iraq, and they didn't really care that much about these journalist vehicles that were around. And there weren't that many. There were only about 10 Gary vehicles at the most. There were hundreds of journalists in Kuwait City at the Hilton who couldn't even get close to the border. And the reason that I was there was because I was following Laurent van der Stock. I wouldn't have pushed that hard, wouldn't have known to push that way, wouldn't have taken that risk of driving through that no man's land. But there we were. And it immediately, as Gary mentioned, became very clear that driving around in our own little vehicles, thank you very much, Hertz, was going to be incredibly unwise because, Gary, I don't know if you remember, and stop me, David, if this is going on too long, but we were in this Safwan, the first town, Iraqi town, that the Marines occupied. And Basra is just 40 kilometers down the road. And me, Gary, Laurent, and about 4 or 5 other vehicles of journalists said, okay, Basra is the big prize down around here. And we asked the US British military there, are there American or British military down that road? Because if there are, we want to go there. We want to get to the very front line. And we were told, yes, you can go down that road towards Basra. There's US British military ahead. Laurent was driving the first vehicle of this convoy, and there were whatever, 5 or 6 maybe journalist vehicles there. And Laurent was the first to notice, and Gary, correct me if my recollection is wrong in any way. Laurent was the first to notice the Iraqi soldiers on the side of the road who were waving little white flags, trying to surrender to us. And I soon after saw that. Laurent immediately does a U-turn, and we all do U-turns because we realize, no, there is no American military or British military on this road. We're the first fucking ones. That's why the Iraqis are trying to surrender to us. And thank God they were trying to surrender to us and not shoot us. And then we raced back to the American-British front lines outside Southbourne. And very luckily, because we had just left them, they recognized us. So they didn't shoot us. Because the next day, there was a crew from ITN that was in a very similar situation. And they got shot at by the American and British troops because they were unidentified vehicles traveling around the war zone. So we realized then, Gary, that we could not leave the shadow of an American military unit, because if we did, we get shot either by the Americans or by the Iraqis.
Yeah. We have a it's a side comment and pointing to something slightly absurd, not hugely significant in itself, but Ted in the audience says, going to war in a rental car seems absurd, surreal almost. I mean, it does from the outside. Do you tell the guy at the Hertz desk where you're going? I mean,
No.
No, well, actually, I can tell a very, very quick, funny story about this. No, and I mean, Gary, I don't know what your experience was, but I think we had to sign, like, when you rented these vehicles. I mean, you're in Kuwait City, and you're American, and it's quite clear you're a journalist, and it's quite clear what you're up to. And so you had to sign a document saying you're not going to take this vehicle out of country. Right. And so, of course, we all signed it. Of course, we took the vehicles out of country. And the funny little bit is that first night, after we kind of raced back to the American lines, and we slept in our vehicles under an overpass, everything's going on around us. And but we're very close to Kuwait. We're just like, whatever, a kilometer or 2 from Kuwait. And I had a Kuwaiti cell phone, and it rings. And it's the fucking Hertz office in Kuwait City saying, excuse me, Mr. Maass, we just want to confirm that you're going to be bringing the car back, whatever it was, in a week's time or whatever, and you're not going to be taking it out of the country. And I remember kind of cupping my hand over the phone so they couldn't hear the machine gun fire in the background, saying, oh, yes, no problem at all. I'm just right now out to dinner with a friend in Kuwait City. Goodbye. So yes, and 3 months later, I returned the car, greatly damaged to her.
My car was destroyed
after it had been to Baghdad and back.
So,
crashed.
What are you going to do?
Yeah. Take us to Baghdad itself now. Take us to Firdos Square, because the invasion was quite successful in a military sense in terms of the forces getting to the capital city very quickly. What was that like? And when you arrived in the capital, was it different to the experience of coming up through the country?
Well, since I've been talking a lot, I'll kind of defer to Gary on this, although I'd just like to add one thing. A really good question that was asked and that was discussed was about kind of relations between journalists and soldiers or Marines. And everybody's different in how you handle these things. And I tend to not try to be confrontational with the subjects that I'm working with, unless I think being confrontational is going to advance my reporting in some fashion. And so I did not have the kinds of discussions that I think Gary and maybe Chris and others had with their folks. In fact, and this is very much to the credit of Gary and others who did, When we were at Diyala on the day after the Marines had shot up all these civilians, and Gary showed some of those pictures. I wrote about this afterwards in my story. We were on that road and there were, shot up cars, civilian corpses all around us. And I was standing next to or near Gary, and Gary said, I don't know if he was speaking to me or somebody else, I forget. He said very loudly for others to hear, this is a crime. These civilians should not have been killed. This is a horror show. And I didn't say anything. And then a Marine, not at that moment, but in response to Gary, maybe Gary was now out of earshot, just started going off at me, what the fuck are you saying? How are we supposed to know? One car's got soldiers, another car's got civilians, innocent people die, we have to protect ourselves, etc. And I just wrote it all down. And so I didn't say anything. I didn't confront that Marine. I listened to him and I wrote it down, and I, didn't say what Gary said. I listened to it and wrote it down. And then I wrote about it afterwards in my story, and I've repeated it in other places since. So we roll in different ways. And it's very good that Gary and others roll the way they do.
Entering Baghdad, again, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines didn't end up in Baghdad because they planned to be in Baghdad. That was sort of serendipity, really. And there are different perspectives on this, but I think must have been April, I don't know, Peter, maybe it was the Sunday. It was the day we'd crossed the bridge, the morning after, the civilians had all been killed. I received phone calls from Jamie Welford, who was then the photo editor I was working with at Newsweek, asking me where I was, where the Marines were, and was there any chance that they could, or I could persuade them to go into Baghdad to rescue a colleague who was having a nervous breakdown. I was like, look, dude, I'm not, that's kind of above my pay scale, but, I'll see what I can do. Simultaneously, Remy Audin, the Monde correspondent, great friend of ours, who was in Baghdad, had been in contact with Laurent van der Stok, who's working with Peter for the New York Times magazine, and said, look, there's a vacuum here. The Iraqis have all gone. The US Army are on the other side of the river. There's nobody here. And, when are you guys coming in? And so I think Laurent and I can't remember if anybody else did, but we certainly had a conversation with Colonel McCoy and said, look, there's nothing between you and the Palestine Hotel where the world's media are with live TV cameras, and Baghdad has yet to be liberated, in inverted commas. And they're looking for a story. We've got mates there who are in trouble, and can we get there? And I remember McCoy bringing out this map, and he said, look, that's not in our battle zone, but let me see what I can do. And he called, I think it was Colonel Hummer, I can't remember, but he called, his superior officer, and somehow, I don't know, how it worked out, but they got permission to enter Firdos Square. So the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines ended up in Firdos Square, frankly, because we gave them the idea. The rest is history, as they say. And I know Peter's written extensively about that, but he may have more detail, more to add. And again, there are many different perspectives, but that's my recollection of events.
Yeah. So Peter, tell us a bit more about Firdos Square, because this is one of the interesting, perhaps pivotal moments of the war in terms of representing the end of the invasion and allegedly the success of the invasion. When the Marines arrive in Firdos Square, there's a very small crowd of Iraqis, as I understand it, and the Marines end up attracting more. And then there's this interesting symbiosis between who's initiating action and who's responding to action. Take us through what leads to the iconic toppling of the statue.
So the this battalion that Gary and I were following, as our luck would have it, this is the battalion that ended up in the center of Baghdad, taking down this statue, which was at Firdos Square, right adjacent to the Palestine Hotel, where more than several hundred journalists, international journalists, were staying during the invasion. And because they were staying there, they had all of their camera gear to go live, because they'd been going live when they were allowed to by the Iraqi authorities during the invasion. And once the Marines arrived there, they immediately went live. They had the capability to do so. They no longer were under Iraqi control, obviously. And it was a dramatic moment of, the American military entering the heart of the Iraqi capital as all Iraqi military resistance faded away. And so it was broadcast live, and that's a legitimate thing to do. But what then happened is that there's this statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square, and you can see it there. This is the story I wrote for the New Yorker, actually 8 years after the fact, where I reconstructed and deconstructed the toppling, how it happened. And so a few very small number of Iraqis entered the square, and one of the Marines gave them a sledgehammer and a rope to start taking a whack at the statue to get it down. And they did, and the photographers, camera people who were there, were recording that. But what was interesting, and this is where, Gary can maybe speak more to it. I did a lot of work afterwards, talking to photojournalists, talking to Iraqis, and also researching the kind of visual history, looking at videos of what actually happened. But very quickly, after a few minutes of genuine enthusiasm by the extremely small number of Iraqis who were there, everything kind of faded away. They weren't going to pull the statue down with that rope. They weren't going to, bash the foundation to smithereens with the sledgehammer they have. And the photographers and video people had kind of gotten the pictures that they needed, and so it kind of died off, and nothing else was going to happen. Except that the commander, McCoy, who was the one who had made the unusual decision to allow Gary, myself, and other journalists to follow his battalion, realized that this was a moment or an occasion or an opportunity that should not be missed. And this speaks to what I think Chris had mentioned earlier about kind of the Marines having greater facility or desire to work with and to use the media. McCoy realized this could be a very good moment for the Marines to take down this statue. And so he called his commander and got permission to use the Marine vehicle to take it down. At that moment, when he kind of got that permission, nothing was really happening there in the square with respect to that statue. The few Iraqis who were there had drifted off. The journalists who were all there had kind of drifted off to do other things, still kind of within the square. And this M88 tank recovery vehicle, and you see it there, it's kind of the one that these Marines are on top of, motors up to the statue. And as it does, Iraqis and journalists who see that happening reconverge at the statue because, hey, showtime's about to begin. And indeed, all the journalists come back. The Iraqis who are in or around the square, there still aren't that many. I mean, maybe it's gone from a few dozen to 100 tops, congregate around the statue, and the M88 begins the whole process of taking it down. And the broadcasting live kind of resumed with this. And it was, dramatic to look at because most of the shots are tight and you kind of see, and particularly with pictures afterwards, just the Iraqis who were very excitedly sledgehammering, etc. But if you peel back, the square was mostly empty. And there weren't that many Iraqis there. And of course, the main story is that this would not have happened were it not for the Marines doing it, tearing it down. And it also wouldn't have happened were it not for the journalists being there, broadcasting and kind of with their cameras, encouraging the few Iraqis who were there to actually engage in all of this. They would have wandered off long earlier. And of course, subsequently, this just became the moment. Iraq is liberated. The statue comes down. Look at these happy Iraqis, delirious over what's going on. And in a very small way, this was true. There were some Iraqis there. They were very happy. And there were a lot of Iraqis throughout Iraq who were very happy that Saddam was gone. But what was going on in Baghdad that day overall was chaotic. There was looting. There was still fighting going on. And, this narrative of a happy liberation, the invasion's over, it's done, it's good, America succeeded, mission accomplished, was wrong. It was wrong from the instant it was, broadcast. And it was, catapulted to a great degree by these visuals that were, in a very narrow sense, accurate. Statue was torn down. There were Iraqis there, but more broadly speaking, inaccurate and not representative of either what was happening in Baghdad or representative of what the future of Iraq would be like.
Is this just an inevitable problem of a situation like this? This, on the one hand, from a narrow frame, it's accurate. From a broader frame and a narrative, it's inaccurate. Is there any way around this? Is there any way to negotiate this? Or are we stuck in a circumstance, as it were, when you're reporting on the ground and you're up close, that's going to be accurate in the moment, but could be fed into other narratives that are counter to what is being reported?
Well, I should hand over here to Gary and to Chris, because again, I've been talking a lot, but just one quick thing I'll mention. I mean, as part of my reporting for this story, I got back in touch with journalists I knew and others who I didn't know. And there was a surprising, maybe to me at the time surprising, but no longer, amount of editorial control that was exerted kind of back in the US by editors. Robert Collier, San Francisco Chronicle reporter, his copy from Firdos Square was basically rewritten by his editors to kind of have this happy, delirious liberation narrative, which was not at all what he sent them. Ann Garrels, the late Ann Garrels of NPR, came under a lot of pressure for her stories. She wrote about it in her memoir. And I think, Gary, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'll hand over here. I recall Gary having some interesting conversations with Newsweek too about what he was doing at the Square and what should be done.
Yeah, I mean, I was standing with Colonel McCoy. We were actually smoking a cigar when some Iraqis came over and asked if this vehicle could be used to pull down the statue. And initially he said no. The request came from one of the sergeants, I think, and he said, give them a sledgehammer or give them some stuff. And then the second request came in. He then called up the chain of command and got permission to allow everyone to use his vehicle. So, I think that the request did. I think what McCoy was brilliant at was taking an opportunity. And I think he understood when we arrived with his unit at the beginning of the invasion, Peter, that having you from the New York Times with Laurent, me from Newsweek, he already had Time magazine there. In our group also were a correspondent and a photographer for AP, plus all the French agencies. Having that much, that number of journalists in his unit would give his unit a disproportionate sort of presence in the war. And one of the things that I remember discussing with him during the course of the invasion was, and he was very aware of the relationship that the US Marines have had with the press, and the power of symbolic imagery. You look at, Iwo Jima, you look at Hue in Vietnam, and the Marines, of course, are much smaller than the Army. So any opportunity they can get to, use the media to enhance themselves and get one over the Army, they will take. And he did that, I think, very well. And I think Firdos Square is an example of that. I do remember, as Peter alluded to, my colleague Ron Haviva, I know is listening in here, and I both worked for Newsweek. And when we arrived in Firdos Square, Newsweek contacted us both and said they were going to do an issue called Liberation. And I remember sharing this with Colonel McCoy, and he looked at me and he said, Gary, this isn't a liberation, it's an occupation. And this is the day they'd arrived in Baghdad, right? So he was under no mistake about what this was. And Ron and I both communicated to Newsweek, this is not, what it looks like if you're looking at the live images from this square, as Peter said, of this statue coming down. This is not the reality that we're seeing. And I kept getting requests. Can you take pictures of people putting flowers in the barrels of the Marines' guns? We've seen one from I think Tyler Hicks, New York Times. I hadn't seen any such thing. And one of the things that aggravated me about my coverage of this war and about my relationship with Newsweek is that rather than accept the truth and tell the truth and publish the truth, what they did in this case is they just cancelled the special edition, right? Because it didn't fit, what they were hearing from the ground, from the correspondents and photographers, simply didn't fit the narrative that they wanted to perpetuate from New York. And in fact, that really, this whole experience of Iraq precipitated my departure from, being a journalist.
I was really upset because I arrived in Baghdad on the 6th, and the amount of dead I saw and what I witnessed, and I moved the pictures. And remember, I'm working for a weekly. By the time the magazine come out, it was all, waving flowers and children, and they were talking to me and they said, send us something of that and you'll get in the magazine. And none of those pictures time ran at that time period because it didn't fit that week's agenda. The western half of Baghdad was fighting even on that day, on the 9th. I'm watching this stuff. I'm on my sat phone with my wife, who's watching on TV that they're going to take the statue down. You know how hard it was for me to get on the other side of the town. I left my unit. I walked out onto the road and flagged down a taxi with the Americans with the binoculars freaking out. Where's he going? And tried to get into a taxi to take me to the other side of the city. And the soldier freaked out. Not the soldier, the taxi driver. He went around 50 meters and I got out and I put an orange thing on he was afraid the Americans were going to shoot him because there's destroyed taxis everywhere. I'm in one of those red and orange and white taxis trying to get to the square from the other northwest. And it's crazy. I put one of those orange things on the front. And the taxi driver kicked me out of the vehicle and I had to walk back to the Americans. And then the colonel eventually got me on a tank and there's no seats on an M1A1. But the next day I had to have them drive me into the green zone area where the palace was going to be to switch up, to hook up with Kim Reisinger and Chris Anderson, because I needed to get out because we were guarding some water treatment plant. But so this is before kind of the statue coming down. So there was still fighting and whatever. And I had actually, the day before on the 8th, I made my way down to the airport to try to get, and I was detained. I was almost arrested because the DOD saw, there he is. There's this Christopher Morris who's been violating the pool. They placed me under arrest. They put me in a room at the airport and they were going to send me back to Kuwait. And I had to sneak off and run back and jump into a supply vehicle to try to hip hop back to my unit. And while I was doing that, everywhere I was going, there was fighting outside. I'm in one of those canvas lorries. I spent a whole day logistically just trying to get from one side of the city to the other. But what for me, I was so upset with my editors because all they wanted to see were flowers and happiness. And I wasn't seeing any of that. even the day when I rode the tank I rode on the roof next to the thing. They let me sit up there on the thing. That's very rare. U.S. military drive me across Baghdad on the roof of an M1A1. The people were doing this to me with their hands. They're looking. They're all doing that, going through the crowd. I'm like, whoa, what, this is, So yeah, but the illusion, they had this, there was in back home with the editors, they had an illusion that they had to fit. So they're picking through the images of the puzzle. If they have 100 dead people, they're going to pick the one with the flower being put into a gun. It's just a horrible dynamics, the disconnect between the editors and the government and what the agenda is. Sorry, I'm going off on that. I'll let you guys go. Sorry.
My editors apologized to me at the end of the war, and not the photo editors, but the editor of the magazine, for the way they had covered the war, which I thought was pretty extraordinary. That never happened to me before or since. And I remember the editor.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the editor told me, he said, I was convinced that our public wouldn't tolerate the truth. And the magazine, you have to remember, that time, the magazines were struggling financially. This was sort of the beginning of the end, really, of print journalism. The war had given them a little blip. They were getting a lot of readers, but the magazines were struggling, and they were very, very, very conscious of losing readership. And America at this time was in this sort of, incredibly, this patriotic, nationalistic sort of fervor. And sharing with the American public things that they uncomfortable truths wasn't something that my editors at least felt they could do. It wasn't really, I think, until Seymour Hersh started publishing about Abu Ghraib that the American media did start confronting the reality of what was happening in Iraq.
Yeah, those Abu Ghraib pictures of 2004 were a seminal change in the narrative. And of course, they were pictures actually taken by participants in the torture itself and then released because of the circumstances. And of course, it's worth observing too that the New York Times, which had completely absorbed the official line from intelligence of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be false, ended up publishing a front page editorial apologizing for its coverage in its written journalism and its failure to kind of critically look at those questions. I mean, that's one of the larger issues coming out of this journalism and the coverage of Iraq is the loss of trust in journalism by a lot of people as a result of the story around weapons of mass destruction, etc. I want to bring in a couple of questions from the audience, and I want to combine. There are similar questions from Kate, Lily, and Peter, and so anyone can respond to these. But how did the behavior of the American military in this invasion compare to other situations appear to you? Were there American or British soldiers expressing regret or sadness over the killing of civilians, or did they just think that collateral damage, which was the phrase, was just an inevitable part of conflict like this?
I'll speak. My first sergeant was in Panama during the invasion of Panama, and he was almost court-martialed. He killed a bunch of civilians. I believe one of them was even an American in a vehicle. And he had conversations with him about it, and of course he felt bad about it. But to him, a lot of these soldiers, they had never even been out of America. You have to understand, they were really plopped down. And you saw the picture of the soldiers taking a picture of the dead body. It's the first time a lot of them have ever even seen a dead body. For them, the ones I had spoke to, it's just shit happens. It is what it is. It is what it is. Even in friendly fire incidents, these are people that join the military. So there's remorse. With the farmer, there's remorse. That's also why they're trying to cover it up and not allow me to photograph. They realize what they've done is morally wrong, but what the fuck? He could have had a truck bomb and blown us all up. I had over the radar my officer saying, don't let that truck come up the road. I got to stop that truck. The problem is, here's the problem, education. They don't know how to stop that truck. They don't know culturally who these people are. They don't know where they go. I met with a 3-star general before the night of the invasion, who was my driver, who I brought from Florida. I don't want to get into that story, but he was in the military. I hired a lieutenant colonel to be my driver. That's how prepared I was. I met with this guy, this general commander, number 3 in charge. And he basically said to me just before the invasion, he said, he was on the TWA hijack plane in Beirut. He got off on the connecting flight, and he was also in the Pentagon when he stopped. Now here's a West Point educated 3-star general, and he's telling me this invasion is about payback. Payback. Now think about that. Payback. What did Beirut hijacking? What did Twin Towers have to do with anything with Iraq? It's education of ignorance. And that went from private all the way up to general. All these people, what they knew nothing of Najaf, Karbala, Shiite, Sunni, ignorant. You know, if they found somebody with a stack of money, they would take it from them and they would tie him up and handcuff him and throw him in a field. And that money's worth like $20. You guys are, they look like bank robbers. These must be bank robbers. What it is, it's just a lack of education. When they train the troops before they go, they need to spend years and months on educating on the culture, where they're going to go. And then you wouldn't have them shooting at a farmer coming up the road, because you'll know how to stop the truck and see. Basically, that's my pure ignorance and pure hubris by all involved, all the way from Cheney all the way down to the private, of not understanding the culture and where they're going to liberate. And in the end, they become whatever. Sorry. That's my.
The Marines that I spoke to, the incident that Peter and I discussed earlier, where, you know, I felt that crimes had been committed, war crimes to be clear. There was a lot of disagreement between the Marines themselves, actually, and a lot of dialogue between them over this particular incident, where, you know, I felt there'd been a breakdown in command. The Captain Norton of the company that was responsible for this, had, I think, you know, didn't have control and had communicated to his troops to basically, you know, treat anything that came towards them as hostile. And these are guys, you know, who just had friends killed. You know, surge of adrenaline, you know, take a bridge, run across, set up a defensive position, and then, you know, just shoot up anything in front of them. But a lot of the Marines, to be fair to them, felt very, very uncomfortable with that. Very, very uncomfortable. And at that time. And subsequently, you know, I know from having a conversation actually with one of the officers this weekend who I saw, you know, there's been a lot of dialogue between many of the officers since about these incidents, and they are very uncomfortable and have been since the war, since this battle, with the death of so many civilians, because there were these guys killed a lot of civilians,
and you're
not
looking
a handful.
Yeah, but you're looking, Gary. We're a small group. There was a big invasion of the country, and you can imagine the amount of this that went on. It went on everywhere. On that 6th, when we were approaching that area of Baghdad, I saw maybe 50 meters, 80 meters away along the wall, 2 civilian men running, one of them carrying a bucket, and they're running. The reason they're running is because all the shooting's going on, and the guy next to me opens up. He's been waiting to shoot at something. He's got his M4, and he opens up on these 2 guys running the thing, and you see the bullets spraying, and they go to jump over a wall, and the guy with the bucket going over the wall drops the bucket, and it looks like he got whacked in the foot. He made it over the wall, and I start screaming at the guy, "Why are you shooting? Stop shooting!" And I says he doesn't. And I asked, "Why did you shoot?" You know what he said? Because he's running.
Yeah.
No,
our unit
running.
shot up a school bus.
But what I'm saying is, it went on when a mechanized army is going into a place. If you are a civilian, you're above ground, it's all fair game to them. They don't understand. It's supposed to come down. You're not supposed to shoot at the vehicles, but they're all so pumped up they're trying to kill people, and then they feel everybody's trying to kill them. I mean, look how cops, when they pull you over on the highway, they all think that we're all out there to kill them. Relax, everybody calm down. Sorry. That's what I was just shocked what I saw, because I've covered so many armies, and you hear about ethnic cleansing and all that kind of stuff going on. And yes, they're not putting people up against the wall and executing, but you don't even know who's in that vehicle coming up the road. That's what happened with Blackwater at that square. You know, they basically shoot at anything that moves, anything that's a threat.
Sure.
So, well,
I think that, you know, one of the things that Chris, that you and Gary are getting at, it's a kind of a unappreciated or underappreciated truth, is that there's this idea in America, I think, still that, like, okay, the occupation of Iraq was really messed up, but the invasion was successful. That, like, in 3 weeks, the American military conquered Iraq. That was done brilliantly. It was just the occupation, everything afterwards. And I think what we're talking about here is this fact that, like, no, this invasion, involved, brutal killings of a large and obviously unacceptable number of civilians. Any civilians would be unacceptable, but it was truly a large number that still hasn't registered. I think that this kind of, there's this,
I was in Panama. I saw a field with over 1,000 civilians buried, tried to get a picture of that and got chased. They hide that stuff. That stuff is never to be seen. That's why they don't want to have, they want to have you embed. They want to try to control. They don't want to have unilateral meeting going around. You know, all these Operation Just Cause, just the names they use, Iraqi freedom, all that stuff. It's to create this illusion, because they know that colonel knows to give the order. Look, you cannot let that truck come up the road. I can't look at the pullout of Afghanistan at the checkpoint with all those Marines got killed. Everybody becomes a threat. You're going to get blown up. So everybody's kind of on edge. But the American public does not know and does not want to know what goes on. They don't.
Peter, why do you think it's underappreciated, the number of the level of civilian killing and death?
well, I mean, overall, the number and level of civilian deaths in Iraq is infrequently mentioned in America. Forget about the toll during just the invasion itself, which I think is really has been underreported and underappreciated. But overall, it's at least several 100,000 Iraqi civilians killed, as in the invasion and the war that continued after it. And the total number, including indirect deaths from malnutrition or disease, is much, much higher. You don't see that number in the American media very much. And it's just in passing in some stories. You can read entire stories on the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq that do not mention civilian casualties of an order that's just, mind-boggling. And on an order that demands, if you recognize it, criminal investigations of top leadership for what happened in this illegal invasion. So that's, one of the main reasons why you don't have, people kind of understanding it, because they don't even see that number. It's not emphasized that much, and it's just referenced in a pause in a sentence, and then move right along. But what does that mean? Let's just stay there for a moment, America. What does this mean? Several 100,000 civilians killed. What does this mean for us? What we have done, and what we should do as a result of that in the way of compensation, in the way of atonement. That's the place that stories never settle on. They always move away very quickly from that. The country does.
I was doing some research recently on military and civilian deaths in war, and the number of civilian and to military deaths now to World War I is directly inverse. So with all of these technological advancements, right, all of our ability to see the battlefield from everywhere, right, the consequence of all of that is the ratio of civilians who are killed today versus soldiers is directly inverse. So it's not soldiers killing soldiers in trenches, right? It's soldiers killing civilians, and it's absolutely outrageous. And if you are in front of a military like the US military during the invasion, God help you. God help you. You know, what we saw ahead of us is just this wave of artillery and airstrikes, helicopters. It's, you know, and then if you get past that, you know, you're getting, you know, direct machine gun fire.
They're so avert to have any casualties themselves.
Yes.
That they do not move forward until they know that they can move forward safely. When we sat outside Tallil Air Base for like 6 hours because they were analyzing what to do. Like, and they've got all these M1 tanks. It's all this, and the protect, because they don't want to lose anybody. They don't want to have happen what happened with Russia with all, they weren't sure that, you know, are they going to get blown up, the tanks or whatever. They moved very, very slowly in the beginning, you know, until they realize, you know, it's we're not a country that handles casualties well on ourselves, so they have to really protect themselves. Hence, you can't allow that vehicle up the road, you know, and their way to stop it is to shoot the vehicle, shoot the engine, shoot the tires. So inevitably, it's just the military doctrine of how you go into a city. It's like, but they don't understand. People are returning from their fields. People are going to work. Not everybody even knows you're there, you know, those first day. I guarantee you those farmers in Karbala probably didn't even know the Americans were coming up the road. Even that young family, the boy in the desert, it looked like we had fallen from Mars. What are we doing in their land? They don't even know who these people are. And they're pointing guns at them. They don't speak the language. And inevitably, a lot of people got hurt. Yeah, sorry, I'm going on that stuff. But
there's this mantra, you know, with the US military, David, it's called force protection, right? And that drives everything. It drives absolutely everything. And that's the only military I know, you know, who puts that force protection before protecting civilians, right? Yeah. You know, the only military I've worked with, let's say, I'm pretty certain the Russians don't put the civilians first either, but you know, it's a terrifying thing to behold.
Yeah, it's the perversity that reducing your own military casualties as a strategic objective leads to increased civilian casualties as a result. And then, as Peter says, that story is not covered as much as it should be and not referenced as much as it should be.
Peter, you went back with Gilles. Didn't you go back to do a story? The magazine, you went back, that, like, what year was that? 2005, 2004?
Yeah, well, 2005. I mean, I returned several times, but I went back in 2005 with Gilles Perez, another kind of.
It's a fantastic piece. Fantastic.
And, we did a story about this kind of very dirty counterinsurgency that the U.S. military was kind of organizing. It's the cover of the New York Times Magazine.
There we go. Yeah.
Photograph.
Yeah.
And, you know, so, I mean, what to say about all that? I'll just say is that, I mean, the American media did a much better job once, you know, things settled in Iraq and it became clear what a terrible crime this whole thing was and was continuing to be. And there was a lot of, unlike the invasion and the pre-invasion period, after, in the coverage of the occupation of Iraq, there was a lot of, I think, really good journalism that was done, that the journalists who were doing it were getting a lot of pushback from, not from their editors this time, but from, you know, politicians and from, you know, pundits on TV and all that. But there was a real struggle going on, and some really good journalism that was accomplished finally, once we had a chance to really get on the ground and do our work.
Yes. So how many times did you go back after the invasion? How much time? You made multiple trips?
Yeah, I made multiple trips for the Times Magazine. Just there were two main ones. There's this one for about a month or more with Gilles in 2005, and I did another one in 2004 with Chris Anderson, and that was where I did a story about this one of the officers on the ground who was kind of trying to figure out how to do counterinsurgency. This is in the very early days of that, a guy named John Noggle. And I did a couple other stories for the magazine too, working with Ruth Fremsen on one occasion in the immediate aftermath of the invasion.
Yes.
But there was a lot of, I mean, we've criticized ourselves and our colleagues a lot and our industry a lot, which it deserves for what it did and what it failed to do and what it still fails to do. But at the same time, there was a lot of journalists lost their lives and got injured and suffered the same traumatic aftermath of combat that combatants did too, and did some good work for it. So it's not entirely a picture of the media itself, I think.
I'm not trying to slight my colleagues and stuff. It mainly for me comes back to the editorial decisions that are made. It's not the people that are in the field reporting it and documenting it. It's how it gets repackaged on the other end. And you were in the New York Times Sunday magazine is a different nut than the. Yeah. You have your piece is your piece. Your work is your work.
Well, it is a different situation when you're writing for the New York Times magazine as opposed to the New York Times newspaper. If you're a magazine writer for any magazine, pretty much, maybe not Time and Newsweek at that time though, you are expected to have a voice, and that voice includes a view. And if you're writing for the newspaper, that's really not the case. Even though under those restrictions, nonetheless, there was still some very good reporting by people like Wilkins, et cetera.
Yeah. So I'm mindful that we're coming towards the end of our time, but I do have a couple of quick questions to finish with. Before that, though, I want to say thank you to Lily, who's in the audience. Lily is the principal researcher of Iraq body count, and she notes that they documented that during the invasion, March 20 to May the 1st, 2003, there was at least 7,500 civilian deaths as a result of the invasion. And I think that's very important to acknowledge. That's an extraordinary number. Two final questions. One, Gary, if I can ask you this, you made the observation earlier that your experience covering Iraq in 2003 kind of led to the end of your desire to cover these sorts of situations and led you to question journalism. Can you say a little bit more about that? And also, can you connect that maybe to how you view Ukraine now and the coverage coming out of Ukraine? Has there been a change in the sort of coverage that you think people are doing of a situation like Ukraine compared to Iraq in 2003? Difficult question.
Sure. So, I felt after this experience and subsequent sort of assignments in Iraq in the year or two that followed, that my contract, if you like, with the people I'm documenting, whether it's US Marines in this case or civilians, is that I will attempt to tell, a truth, right? The truth as I see it. I will try to represent their experience as honestly as I am able. And, one is taking extraordinary risks to do that as well. And I felt at a certain point that, my work was not being used properly. And it wasn't being used because it wasn't good enough. It was being used because it didn't fit into the worldview of the editors I was working for. And so my contract with the people I was photographing was broken. And also the risks that I was taking, which were quite extreme sometimes, weren't worth it. And so, although I'm a great believer in journalism, good journalism, and I have a lot of faith in my colleagues in the field, I would like to say, huge faith, actually. I don't have a lot of faith in editors back home. And so I no longer wanted to participate in that. And, I still perpetuate journalism and storytelling, but in a different way. With regards to Ukraine, it's difficult for me to comment, with great authority because I haven't covered Ukraine. But what I am aware of in Ukraine is I can see that the access to the story on one side, the Russian side, is non-existent. And on the Ukrainian side, it is highly controlled, make no mistake. And very often, I think what you see is with the sort of the narrative arc of, war journalism since Vietnam is that, successive militaries and successive regimes understand the mistakes that previous regimes and other previous militaries made, allowing journalists too much access to the front lines and to the story. And so I think what you can see clearly in Ukraine is on one side there is no access, and on the other side access is extremely controlled and extremely limited, and therefore has limited value. It doesn't mean that it's valueless, and it doesn't mean that some journalists are doing incredible work, because they are. It just means that for the most part, I think the coverage is not as insightful as one would hope.
Yeah, and in those sorts of circumstances, we talk rightly about wanting to support independent journalism, but you can't have independent journalism in those circumstances. The logistics are too difficult, the security is too dangerous, etc.
Even in Iraq, Peter and I were independent insofar as we could make a lot of decisions by ourselves. But in reality, we were both supported by media with deep pockets. Yeah. My satellite phone bill alone, I think, was $45,000 from that 5-week period. So, and I think my car had to be replaced by Davis. Just that the cost of that story was extraordinary. And I was one of 5 or 6 Newsweek photographers, and they probably had at least as many correspondents. So, if you're going to Ukraine now, not only do you have to insure yourself, but, you've got to live, you've got to eat, you've got to, drive around, it's just, the cost is enormous. The monetary cost is enormous. And the possibility of success is minimal. So, there's a disincentive to cover that story if you're really freelance and independent.
Yeah. So final question to you, Peter. Looking back now, 20 years later, and thinking also of Ukraine in the present, other conflicts in the present, what do you think are the lessons, or what would you take as the major lesson from your experience covering the invasion of Iraq?
Well, the easy one obviously is don't send your army to invade a foreign country that has not attacked you. That's a basic one that we should not have to be relearning now. But more personally in a way, and I don't know if this may apply to Gary and Chris, and Gary kind of mentioned this, is that I find myself, it's almost more important for us to tell these stories now than it was at the time. There were a lot of people telling these stories at the time. Maybe they weren't heard, but they were. And now there aren't as many reminding people, this is what happened. This is why it happened. This is what it means. This is who we are as a nation. And, somebody who's in college right now, they were not born when this war happened. So of course they know nothing about it. They shouldn't. And our educational system is not trying to educate them about that. And so just personally, kind of my lesson learned, and this also comes from having covered the war in Bosnia, where now, 30 years later, the essential truths of the genocide that occurred there are, under assault. The lesson learned is that, we still have to keep doing this job of telling these war stories. They're 20 years old or they're 30 years old, but they are current history for people who actually know nothing about them and have been, in some cases, informed, to the opposite of what really happened. So, our work is, and Gary's finding different ways, and Chris is too, and maybe just some of the old ways too. The work continues of telling the world about what we've seen.
Well, I think that's an appropriate place after 90 minutes to conclude. We have had a lot of great questions from the audience. I think they could go on for some time, but I think we've taken enough of your time. So I just want to say thank you very much, Gary, Peter, Christopher, for participating. Show us your work discussing this. We're going to be coming back to these issues in relationship to other contexts here on 7 Insider and in other events. But today, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for attending. As always, we will put a recording of this up on the website within about a week or so, and we will see you in future events. Thanks very much.